What happened when Aussie SAS waited 12 days in an ambush and shocked impatient U.S. troops? This isn't about patience as a virtue. It's about a completely different way of fighting a war. While American forces conducted loud search-and-destroy sweeps, Australian SAS teams would disappear into the Vietnamese jungle for 2, sometimes 3 weeks at a time, carrying everything on their backs and waiting in absolute silence for the enemy to walk into their kill zones. The psychological toll was brutal. Lying motionless for entire nights, holding in coughs and cramps, fighting your body's urge to scratch an itch while enemy soldiers passed within arm's reach. U.S. observers attached to these patrols struggled with this war of stillness, conditioned to aggressive movement and fire superiority. They couldn't understand how discipline sometimes meant not pulling the trigger. This breakdown covers documented patrol records, oral histories from SAS veterans, and the medical reality of what happened to men who stayed frozen in ambush positions for days without moving. Veterans already know this grind intimately. For everyone else, this is the side of warfare that training manuals never prepared anyone for. If you value unvarnished military truth, subscribe. Check the description for full sourcing. The Jungle War in Vietnam exposed a fundamental divide in military philosophy that would haunt American military doctrine for decades. While U.S. forces conducted massive search-and-destroy operations, flying into landing zones with helicopters and artillery support, the Australian SAS developed what their enemies would come to call a phantom war. The numbers tell the story starkly. The 1st Australian Task Force operated with roughly 4,500 men in Phuoc Tuy Province from 1966, yet their Special Air Service component numbered only 580 men across 3 rotating squadrons over the entire war. These ghost soldiers would conduct approximately 200 combat patrols, inflicting around 600 enemy casualties while suffering just 1 killed in action. 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, and 1 from illness, with 28 wounded. The mathematics of warfare had never seen numbers like this. American doctrine, codified in Field Manual 100-5 and practiced across South Vietnam, favored large unit sweeps through suspected enemy territory. Body count became the primary measure of success, with helicopter mobility and massive firepower the preferred tools of engagement. U.S. conventional infantry patrols typically lasted 3 to 5 days per long-range reconnaissance patrol doctrine, with regular resupply and extraction. The theory was sound: find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with superior firepower. But the Vietnamese jungle had different rules, and the Viet Cong had learned to exploit American predictability. They could hear helicopters from miles away, feel the vibrations of armored columns through the earth, and simply melt into sanctuary areas that American forces could never reach without massive logistical support. The Australian approach in Phuoc Tuy Province emerged from hard-learned lessons in Malaya and Borneo. Instead of chasing big battles, SAS patrols would infiltrate known enemy movement routes and wait. Sometimes they waited for days, sometimes weeks, carrying everything they needed on their backs and moving with a silence that bordered on the supernatural. New Zealand SAS trooper George Babington described patrols lasting probably a maximum of about 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, where they carried all their food, radios, explosives, and medical gear, becoming like pack horses who then had to fight like ghosts. The weight was crushing, typically 80 to 85 pounds of equipment per man, similar to American infantry loads, but carried for exponentially longer periods without resupply. The tactical philosophy represented a complete inversion of American military culture. Where U.S. forces sought contact and decisive engagement, Australian SAS teams positioned themselves as human sensors, gathering intelligence and striking only when conditions were perfect. They understood that in a guerrilla war, presence mattered more than movement, and patience could be more devastating than firepower. Their radio equipment, primarily the AN/PRC-25 and later the PRC-77 with encryption capabilities, weighed up to 54 pounds with batteries and security gear, turning radio operators into walking antenna farms who knew that losing communication meant their patrol was completely alone in enemy territory. The weapons loadout reflected this philosophy of surgical precision over suppressive fire. The M18A1 Claymore mine became the cornerstone of SAS ambush tactics, a 3.5-pound directional weapon containing approximately 700 steel balls that could be daisy-chained and precisely timed to devastating effect. Unlike American forces who often used claymores defensively, SAS teams would pre-position them along enemy tracks and wait for entire formations to enter the kill zone. The psychological discipline required was extraordinary, sitting within meters of their own claymore fragmentation fans for days, betting their lives on proper aiming and detonation timing. American observers attached to these operations initially struggled with what they perceived as passive tactics. Conditioned to aggressive patrolling and fire superiority, U.S. personnel would grow frustrated during long periods without contact, not understanding that information gathering was often more valuable than body count. The cultural shock was profound when they witnessed SAS teams allowing enemy forces to pass unchallenged if the tactical situation wasn't favorable. On February 22, 1968, 8 Australian SAS soldiers remained motionless as hundreds of enemy troops moved past their position in darkness, with one Viet Cong soldier stopping to urinate within 3 feet of their concealed location. Opening fire would have meant almost certain death. 8 men against potentially a battalion-sized force at point-blank range in enemy territory. The enemy's response to SAS tactics revealed their effectiveness. Captured Viet Cong documents referred to the Australian SAS as Ma Rung, phantoms or ghosts of the jungle. Local VC directives advised avoiding contact with Australian patrols whenever possible, recognizing them as a fundamentally different threat from conventional American forces. This wasn't fear based on firepower or numbers, but on the terrible uncertainty of never seeing the enemy until it was too late. Viet Cong fighters could predict American operations, the helicopter insertions, the artillery preparations, the predictable search patterns. But SAS patrols appeared and disappeared like smoke, striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation was possible. The contrast exposed deeper questions about military effectiveness in unconventional warfare. American forces were winning tactical engagements and posting impressive body counts, but the strategic picture remained frustratingly unchanged. Enemy forces continued operating in areas that had been repeatedly swept and cleared. The Australian model suggested that controlling territory required constant presence rather than periodic visits, and that intelligence gathered through patient observation could be more valuable than targets destroyed through aggressive action. The weight of this realization would influence American special operations doctrine for generations, though the institutional preference for technological solutions and overwhelming firepower would prove difficult to overcome. The soldiers who experienced both approaches carried these lessons in their bodies and minds long after the war ended. American veterans often described search and destroy operations as exhausting exercises that produced limited long-term results, while SAS veterans remembered a different kind of warfare entirely, one measured in hours of absolute stillness rather than minutes of intense firefight, where victory was often defined by the shots not fired rather than the targets destroyed. The mathematics of survival in the Vietnamese jungle came down to weight, endurance, and the terrible calculus of what could be carried versus what might be needed to stay alive. For SAS patrols operating beyond the reach of regular resupply, every ounce mattered, and every piece of equipment represented a life or death decision made weeks before the patrol ever left base. The standard load for a 2-week patrol pushed the human body to its absolute limits: rations, water, ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, and explosives, all competing for space on frames that would have to carry this burden through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The food situation alone presented an almost unsolvable problem. Standard military rations provided roughly 3,000 calories per day, but jungle warfare in tropical heat with heavy loads could burn 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily. For a 14-day patrol, each man needed to carry at minimum 42 pounds of rations, assuming perfect caloric efficiency and no wastage. Water requirements were even more critical. A minimum of 1 gallon per day per man in the Vietnamese climate, meaning 112 pounds of water for a 2-week mission. The impossibility of carrying adequate water forced patrols to rely on jungle sources, adding water purification tablets and the constant risk of waterborne diseases to their burden. Many veterans remember the war not as a series of firefights, but as an endless forced march under crushing weight, followed by periods of absolute motionless surveillance. The radio equipment that kept these isolated patrols connected to artillery support and extraction represented both lifeline and curse. The ANPRC-25, weighing 23 pounds without batteries, provided theoretical ranges of 3 to 7 miles under ideal conditions, extending to 12 to 31 miles with the long whip antenna fully deployed. But in dense jungle canopy and mountainous terrain, actual communication ranges fell far short of specifications. The later PRC-77, with attached KY-38 Nestor encryption gear, weighed approximately 54 pounds as a complete system, more than many soldiers weighed when they first enlisted. The radio operator in an SAS patrol became a walking communication center, knowing that if he went down, his team would be completely cut off from outside support. Battery life calculations consumed endless planning sessions. The PRC-25 specifications promised up to 20 hours of operation, but real-world usage in humid conditions with frequent transmission checks could drain batteries in half that time. Spare batteries added pounds to already crushing loads, yet running out of power during a contact or medical emergency meant certain death. The 152 Signal Squadron personnel who supported SAS operations had learned hard lessons about long-range, low probability of intercept communications during earlier conflicts in Borneo. But the Vietnamese jungle presented new challenges in maintaining contact across the extended distances these patrols covered. The Claymore mines that formed the backbone of SAS ambush tactics represented perhaps the most crucial weight-to-effectiveness calculation in the patrol loadout. Each M18A1 Claymore weighed 3.5 pounds and contained approximately 700 steel balls that could be propelled at nearly 4,000 feet per second across a 60-degree arc. The mine's convex design and front-toward-enemy marking made proper emplacement theoretically simple, but the reality of jungle ambushes required careful calculation of fragmentation patterns, blast effects, and the terrifying possibility of misaimed mines creating fratricide situations at point-blank range. The effective beaten zone at 50 meters provided roughly 30% hit probability on man-sized targets, but patrols often positioned their ambushes at much closer ranges where the mathematics became absolutely lethal. The daisy chain capability of Claymore mines allowed a single detonator to trigger multiple weapons simultaneously, creating kill zones that could devastate entire enemy formations in seconds. But this capability came with exponential risk. Carrying 6 to 8 Claymore mines meant over 20 pounds of explosive devices that had to be transported, emplaced, and lived with for days at a time. SAS teams would often position themselves within the outer edge of their own fragmentation fans, calculating blast effects and fragment trajectories with their lives hanging on precise placement and timing. The psychological pressure of sitting for days next to explosives powerful enough to kill everyone within 50 meters required a level of technical confidence and emotional control that broke many otherwise capable soldiers. Medical supplies presented another impossible equation. Standard field medical kits weighed 8 to 12 pounds and contained supplies for treating routine injuries and stabilizing trauma patients for evacuation. But SAS patrols operating beyond helicopter range for weeks at a time faced medical emergencies that could prove fatal without immediate treatment. Morphine, antibiotics, bandages, and surgical supplies competed with food and ammunition for space in packs already pushed beyond human carrying capacity. The decision to include or exclude specific medical items often meant calculating whether a wounded patrol member could be kept alive long enough for the team to fight its way to an extraction point days away. Personal weapons and ammunition loads reflected the SAS philosophy of precision over volume. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian version of the FNFAL, fired the powerful 7.62mm NATO cartridge but weighed over 9 pounds empty. Each 20-round magazine added another pound, and standard combat loads of 200 to 300 rounds per rifleman meant carrying 20 to 30 pounds of ammunition alone. The M60 machine gun, when carried by SAS teams, weighed over 23 pounds with its bipod, and the linked 7.62mm ammunition belts added substantial additional weight. But the stopping power and range of these weapons made them essential for the kind of long-range engagements SAS teams might face when extraction was impossible. The cumulative effect of these load requirements meant SAS troopers routinely carried 80 to 100 pounds of equipment into operations that might last weeks. American observers attached to these patrols expressed amazement at the Australians' willingness to carry such crushing loads, then demonstrate the discipline to remain motionless for days to protect ambush positions. The weight became part of the weapon system, the price paid for independence from resupply helicopters that could compromise patrol locations with their noise and predictable flight patterns. Veterans remember their equipment not as tools, but as extensions of their bodies, each item selected through experience paid for in exhaustion, pain, and the certain knowledge that miscalculations meant death in country where rescue might be impossible. The Vietnamese jungle fought its own war against the human body, a relentless biological assault that never ceased and showed no mercy to friend or enemy. For SAS patrols forced to remain motionless in ambush positions for days at a time, this microscopic battlefield often proved more devastating than any firefight. The medical records from Phuoc Tuy Province paint a grim picture of what happened to soldiers who had to ignore every basic rule of field hygiene in service of tactical necessity. Immersion foot, known to the troops as jungle rot, became an epidemic among long-range patrol units who could not follow the standard medical advice to keep their feet dry and change socks regularly. The pathology was brutally simple. Human skin, designed to shed moisture and breathe, would break down after prolonged exposure to water and restricted blood circulation. In ambush positions where movement meant death, soldiers lay in stagnant water or mud for entire nights, sometimes stretching into days, with no opportunity to remove boots or allow their feet to dry. The constant moisture created perfect conditions for fungal infections that would literally dissolve the skin between toes and on the soles of feet. Medical photographs from Australian war memorial collections show the horrific progression. First, the skin would turn white and wrinkled, then begin sloughing off in sheets, exposing raw flesh beneath. Without treatment, secondary bacterial infections would set in, leading to gangrene and potential amputation. The monsoon season brought 50 inches of rainfall to many areas of South Vietnam, turning the ground into a perpetual swamp that never truly dried. SAS patrols operating during these periods faced an impossible choice: compromise their positions by seeking dry ground, or accept that their feet would be destroyed by the environment they were trying to control. Veterans describe peeling boots off after long ambushes to find skin coming away with the leather, leaving bloody, infected wounds that took weeks to heal. The pain was constant, but moving to relieve it or treat the condition meant potentially exposing the entire patrol to enemy observation. Leeches presented a different kind of torment, one that tested psychological endurance as much as physical tolerance. The Vietnamese jungle harbored multiple species of blood-sucking worms that could detect body heat and carbon dioxide from considerable distances. During static ambush positions, these parasites would find any gap in clothing, around ankles, wrists, necks, or waistbands, and attach themselves with Y-shaped jaws that numbed the skin while they fed. The feeding process could continue for hours, with the leeches swelling to many times their original size as they consumed blood. Removing them improperly by pulling or burning could leave the jaws embedded in the skin, leading to dangerous infections. The psychological impact of feeling leeches crawling under uniforms while being unable to remove them pushed many soldiers to the breaking point. American personnel attached to SAS patrols often struggled most with this aspect of jungle warfare, the feeling of being slowly consumed while duty demanded complete immobility. Some veterans report that decades later, they still instinctively check their skin when feeling any small irritation, their nervous systems permanently programmed by months of suppressing the natural human response to parasitic attack. Insect-borne diseases added another layer of biological warfare to the jungle environment. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes, sand flies that transmitted leishmaniasis, and various tick species created a constant threat that no amount of military training could fully counter. The use of insect repellent had to be carefully balanced against the risk of creating detectable odors that might compromise patrol security. Many units resorted to covering exposed skin with mud and vegetation, accepting the increased risk of skin infections in exchange for reduced insect activity and better camouflage. The booby trap situation in Phuoc Tuy Province represented a deadly chess game where the Viet Cong had turned the Australians' own weapons against them. In 1967, Australian engineers laid extensive minefields around base areas, including one field near Nui Dat that contained 21,048 M16 jumping jack mines. These anti-personnel weapons were designed to bounce 3 feet into the air before detonating, spraying steel fragments in a lethal radius that could kill or maim multiple soldiers simultaneously. The Viet Cong proved remarkably adept at locating and lifting these mines from the Australian defensive perimeters, then relocating them to trails and approach routes where they would claim victims among the very forces that had originally emplaced them. The psychological impact of this weapon turnabout was devastating. SAS patrols moving to ambush positions knew they were walking through areas where every step might trigger explosives originally manufactured in American factories and deployed by Australian engineers. The M16 mines were particularly insidious because they were specifically designed to wound rather than kill, calculating that injured soldiers would consume more enemy resources than dead ones. The blast pattern and fragment velocity were engineered to create survivable but crippling wounds that would require evacuation and long-term medical care. Improvised explosive devices crafted by Viet Cong engineers using captured munitions proved even more unpredictable than standard mines. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, and even claymore-type directional charges were buried along trails and triggered by pressure plates or tripwires that could be virtually invisible to patrol members, focused on navigation and enemy observation. The random nature of these weapons created a constant background stress that wore down even the most experienced soldiers. Unlike firefights, which could be prepared for and trained for, booby traps struck without warning and left survivors questioning every step they took in hostile territory. The role of SAS patrols as human early warning systems placed them in perhaps the most psychologically demanding position of the entire war. Tasked with gathering intelligence rather than engaging the enemy, these teams would spend weeks positioned along infiltration routes, logging enemy movement patterns while under strict orders not to engage unless conditions were absolutely perfect. This meant watching enemy soldiers pass within arm's reach while calculating whether opening fire would accomplish the mission or simply ensure the patrol's destruction. The mathematics were usually clear. A 6-man SAS team engaging a company-sized enemy formation was essentially committing suicide, regardless of tactical advantages. The mental discipline required for this kind of warfare broke many otherwise capable soldiers. Veterans describe the sensation of tasting metal from adrenaline surges while forcing their trigger fingers to remain still, watching potential targets move through perfect ambush zones while mission parameters demanded they continue gathering intelligence rather than engaging. The moral injury of watching enemy formations that might later attack Australian or American units created psychological wounds that many veterans carried for decades after the war ended. The Vietnam War exposed fundamental flaws in Western military doctrine that had been developing since World War II, contradictions that became deadly when applied to jungle warfare against an enemy who refused to fight by conventional rules. American search and destroy operations, codified in Field Manual 100 TAR 5 and practiced across South Vietnam under General Westmoreland's command, represented the culmination of mechanized warfare thinking applied to a conflict that demanded entirely different approaches. The doctrine emphasized attrition through large unit sweeps, overwhelming firepower, and body counts as the primary metric of success. But in the dense jungles and villages of Phuoc Tuy Province, this approach proved not just ineffective, but counterproductive, creating more enemies than it eliminated while consuming enormous resources for minimal strategic gain. The statistical obsession with body counts created perverse incentives that distorted tactical decision-making at every level. Success was measured not by territory controlled or enemy capabilities degraded, but by the number of corpses produced per operation. This metric encouraged large-scale operations that maximized potential enemy contact while minimizing the detailed intelligence work necessary for effective counterinsurgency. American units found themselves conducting massive sweeps through areas where the enemy had already melted away, burning enormous quantities of fuel and ammunition while achieving little beyond temporary displacement of hostile forces. The Viet Cong could hear helicopter formations from miles away, feeling the vibrations through the ground and having ample time to disperse before American forces arrived in their landing zones. The Australian experience in Phuoc Tuai province demonstrated an entirely different approach to the same tactical problems. Rather than seeking large-scale engagements, the 1st Australian Task Force focused on constant presence and detailed knowledge of enemy movement patterns. Their operations were characterized by small unit actions, careful intelligence gathering, and engagements fought on terms favorable to Allied forces rather than dictated by enemy initiative. The statistical results spoke for themselves. Australian forces achieved higher kill ratios with far lower friendly casualties while actually controlling territory rather than simply passing through it during large-scale operations. Equipment failures revealed another fundamental disconnect between doctrine and reality. Standard-issue boots and uniforms had been designed for European climates and conventional warfare, not for the monsoon conditions and extended static operations that characterized jungle warfare. The leather combat boots that performed adequately in temperate climates became instruments of torture in Vietnamese conditions, where they remained soaked for weeks at a time and could not be removed without compromising patrol security. The resulting medical problems, immersion foot, fungal infections, and skin breakdown created casualties that never appeared in enemy action reports, but significantly degraded unit effectiveness. Uniform materials designed for durability and ease of maintenance proved entirely unsuited for conditions where soldiers might lie motionless in mud and stagnant water for days at a time. Cotton fabrics that dried quickly in dry climates remained perpetually damp in jungle conditions, creating ideal environments for bacterial and fungal growth. Synthetic materials that shed water effectively also trapped body heat and moisture, leading to heat casualties and skin breakdown. The procurement systems that had supplied effective equipment for previous conflicts could not adapt quickly enough to address the unique requirements of jungle warfare against an unconventional enemy. The ammunition expenditure rates in Vietnam exposed perhaps the most damning indictment of conventional firepower doctrine. Historical studies suggested that American forces expended approximately 25,000 small arms rounds per enemy soldier killed in World War II, a figure that rose to roughly 50,000 rounds per kill in Korea. Vietnam statistics, while debated and difficult to verify precisely, suggested even higher expenditure rates as American units relied increasingly on suppressive fire and reconnaissance by fire to locate and engage elusive enemies. The spray-and-pray mentality that developed among many conventional units reflected not cowardice or poor training, but the natural response to an enemy who could appear and disappear at will, while American forces remained tied to predictable logistics and movement patterns. Australian SAS forces demonstrated an entirely different relationship with ammunition and firepower. Their carefully planned ambushes, relying on claymore mines and precisely aimed rifle fire, achieved dramatically higher hit rates per round expended. The mathematics were stark. SAS patrols achieved approximately 600 confirmed enemy kills during their deployment while suffering minimal casualties themselves, using far less ammunition per engagement than conventional forces. This efficiency stemmed not from superior marksmanship alone, but from the tactical patience that allowed them to engage only under ideal conditions rather than responding to enemy initiatives. The helicopter mobility that formed the cornerstone of American tactical doctrine proved to be both blessing and curse in the Vietnamese environment. While helicopters provided unprecedented tactical mobility and firepower, they also announced American presence and intentions to enemy forces across vast areas. The distinctive sound of rotor blades carried for miles in jungle conditions, giving Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces ample warning to either prepare ambushes or disperse before American forces could engage. The reliance on helicopter insertion and extraction also tied American operations to weather conditions and landing zone availability, limiting tactical flexibility and creating predictable patterns that enemy forces learned to exploit. The Australian approach to mobility emphasized foot movement and long-duration operations that did not depend on helicopter support for success. SAS patrols inserted by helicopter would then operate independently for weeks, moving silently through terrain where helicopters could not follow and remaining in position regardless of weather conditions that might prevent extraction. This operational independence allowed them to maintain contact with enemy forces during monsoon conditions when American helicopter operations were severely limited. The medical evacuation procedures that worked well for conventional operations proved inadequate for the kind of warfare SAS units conducted. Standard doctrine assumed that wounded soldiers could be evacuated by helicopter within hours of being wounded. But SAS patrols operating in areas beyond helicopter range had to be prepared to treat serious wounds and move casualties on foot to extraction points that might be days away. This requirement fundamentally changed tactical planning, weapons selection, and patrol composition in ways that conventional doctrine had never addressed. The psychological burden of knowing that serious wounds meant probable death rather than evacuation to modern medical facilities created stress levels that traditional military training had not prepared soldiers to handle. The human mind was never designed for the kind of warfare that Australian SAS patrols conducted in the Vietnamese jungle, where success was measured not by action taken but by action withheld, and where survival depended on suppressing every natural human response to danger, discomfort, and opportunity. The 12-day ambush became a form of psychological torture that no military training could fully prepare soldiers to endure. Veterans describe these extended operations not as tactical exercises, but as profound tests of human willpower, where the enemy was as much their own nervous system as any Viet Cong formation that might wander into their kill zone. The mathematics of patience in jungle warfare defied every instinct that kept humans alive throughout evolutionary history. Sitting motionless while insects crawled under uniforms, holding in coughs and sneezes that could compromise the entire mission, forcing cramped muscles to remain still while enemy soldiers passed within arm's reach, this was warfare stripped of everything that made combat psychologically manageable. Traditional military training emphasized aggression, movement, and decisive action. SAS operations demanded the opposite: absolute stillness, infinite patience, and the mental discipline to calculate odds and probabilities, while adrenaline demanded immediate action. The physical toll of extended ambush operations compounded the psychological stress. George Babington's account of carrying maximum loads for 2 to 3 weeks, becoming like pack horses who then had to fight like ghosts, captured the surreal nature of this warfare. The human body, already pushed beyond normal limits by crushing equipment loads, had to maintain absolute noise discipline while fighting the natural responses to pain, fatigue, and biological needs. Eating cold rations in silence, positioned beyond the fragmentation range of their own claymore mines, patrol members lived in a state of constant vigilance that traditional combat did not require. The terror of the February 22, 1968 incident crystallized everything that made SAS warfare psychologically devastating. 8 Australian soldiers lay motionless as hundreds of enemy troops moved past their position in darkness, with one Viet Cong soldier stopping to urinate within 3 feet of their concealed location. The mathematical calculation was brutally simple: 8 men against hundreds, at point-blank range, in enemy territory where extraction was impossible. Opening fire guaranteed death. Remaining silent offered the possibility of survival, but required suppressing every human instinct that had kept the species alive for millennia. The psychological impact of that moment lived in the nervous systems of survivors for decades afterward. Veterans describe the physical sensation of forcing trigger fingers to remain motionless while adrenaline flooded their systems, the taste of metal in their mouths as stress hormones peaked, and the peculiar time distortion that made seconds feel like hours. The enemy soldier urinating so close that they could hear individual drops hitting the ground became a permanent memory that many veterans carried as a marker of the line between survival and annihilation. The knowledge that a single involuntary sound, a cough, a sneeze, the clink of metal against metal, would result in immediate death for the entire patrol created stress levels that pushed human psychology beyond normal parameters. The aftermath of such incidents often proved as psychologically damaging as the events themselves. Patrol members had to process the experience of watching enemy forces that might later attack Australian or American positions, knowing they possessed information that could save lives but being unable to act on it without compromising their mission. The moral weight of restraint, of not pulling triggers when targets were available, created a form of psychological injury that military medical systems were not equipped to recognize or treat. Traditional combat stress reactions were understood and could be addressed, but the stress of controlled non-action represented new territory in military psychology. American observers attached to SAS patrols experienced profound culture shock when confronted with this warfare of patience. Trained for aggressive patrolling, fire superiority, and decisive engagement, U.S. personnel initially interpreted SAS tactics as passive or overly cautious. The reality was far more complex. SAS operations required a level of tactical discipline and psychological control that conventional warfare training did not develop. American soldiers conditioned to 3 to 5 day patrols with regular resupply found the prospect of 2-week operations without external support almost incomprehensible. The psychological adjustment to eating cold food, drinking warm water, and never moving during daylight hours proved more challenging than many firefights. The gradual education of American observers revealed the sophisticated psychology behind SAS tactics. Initial frustration, "When are we going to hit something?" gave way to understanding as they witnessed the intelligence value of patient observation. Enemy movement patterns, logistics routes, and tactical preferences became visible only through extended observation that conventional patrols could never sustain. The kill ratios achieved by SAS units resulted not from superior firepower, but from the psychological discipline to wait for perfect conditions before engaging, ensuring that when violence occurred, it was absolutely decisive. The long-term psychological impact of this warfare extended far beyond the end-of-combat tours. Veterans describe permanent changes in their relationship with time, patience, and decision-making. The ability to remain motionless for hours while calculating probabilities and risks became a skill that transferred imperfectly to civilian life. Many former SAS personnel report decades of hypervigilance, constantly scanning environments for threats, and calculating escape routes in situations where such behavior was unnecessary and counterproductive. The nightmares that followed these veterans home were often not of firefights or dramatic combat, but of the periods of forced stillness where psychological pressure built to unbearable levels. Dreams of being unable to move while threats approached, of suppressing natural responses to danger, of calculating whether to act or remain hidden while lives hung in the balance, these psychological residues proved more persistent than the flashbacks associated with conventional combat trauma. The warfare of patience had created wounds that military medicine was only beginning to understand. Injuries to the nervous system that resulted not from enemy action, but from the superhuman self-control required to fight an invisible war in someone else's jungle.